single day, Monday through Friday, at 9 a.m. Pacific time. It's noon Eastern time. I'll be with you chopping it up for the next 2 hours weekdays. Coming up on the show today, we'll have Evan Silva of EstablishTheRun.com, late of NBC's Roto World. Also, hope to check in with former Packers VP, longtime agent, executive, professor, podcaster, does the Business of Sports podcast, one of the most popular sports podcasts out there, Andrew Brandt. We'll try to touch base with him later on today on the show. And John Canzano of the Oregonian and 750 The Game in Portland, weekday talk show host, will join us as well. We'll talk some Pac-12 football. We'll talk about the state of the Pac-12 and Oregon State coming up. Oregon State has a game at Hawaii. That'll be tomorrow. And Oregon with an intriguing game at home against Nevada, coming off the loss to Auburn. That's a big game. Who would have dreamt it would be a big game for Oregon with Nevada coming off its victory over Purdue? And that game took place in Reno last Saturday as well. So we'll touch base with John Canzano, and we'll then head down to the Valley of the Sun in Phoenix and visit with longtime Phoenix television anchor and reporter Tim Ring of ABC 15. He's going to talk a lot about Kyler Murray and Cliff Kingsbury, break down that situation with the Arizona Cardinals. That's kind of been flying under the radar, believe it or not, after all the hype surrounding the NFL draft and Kyler Murray. So we'll talk to Tim Ring. We'll also get the lowdown perhaps on Arizona State, Arizona college football, maybe mix in some Diamondbacks talk. But coming up next, we'll be visiting with Evan Silva, and we'll talk some fantasy football. Of course, the season got underway in the NFL yesterday with the Bears and Packers. It was a dud. Wasn't any good. Wasn't a good game. And I think the big story, actually, there's two big stories to me that came out of that game. I think the sense that I have now is that the Chicago Bears could end up a dumpster fire. And I mean that literally and specifically. I talked about it yesterday. We talked about the takeaway-based record in offense and defense. Not takeaway isn't necessarily an offensive statistic as far as the Bears, but it leads to offense. But the Bears had 20 takeaways last year as part of that great defense, and they were very reliant on takeaways last year. What happens last night? They are not the beneficiary of takeaways. The offense gets exposed. The defense played extremely well and held Green Bay in check. But unfortunately, Mitchell Trubisky didn't come through. And that, I think, is at the feet of Matt Nagy, the coach of the Chicago Bears, who made some very questionable decisions on offense as he went with the passing game. 45 passes to only 15 runs for the Chicago Bears yesterday. It was a mystifying situation for the Bears play calling and on special teams as they elect in the second half not to go for a 50-yard field goal on a 4th and 10, which has to have you scratching your head if you're a Chicago Bears fan. They bring in Pinheiro, and after the game, you had Nagy saying that Pinheiro he has a great leg. Well, then why aren't you using him? Of course, the Bears a little gun-shy, I think, when it comes to kickers, but you've got to use that kicker in the situation that was at hand when it was a short field and it was a close ball game. 10-3, the Packers win it, but of course the Bears were in it until the very end. So a field goal might have made the difference, at the very least in the field position game for the Chicago Bears, or even maybe trying a pooch kick. Meantime, the Green Bay Packers, I think, showed us something different. Last year, their defense was god-awful. This year, it's finally starting to come to fruition, that draft capital that's been spent on the Green Bay Packers defense, along with free agent acquisitions by Brian Gutekunst, the general manager of the Packers. A breakout performance by the Green Bay Packers defense yesterday. That combined with a fair to middling performance by Aaron Rodgers, who didn't seem to be himself, really. A lot of happy feet, but that I think you can attribute to one of the best defenses in professional football. Rondo Smith really starting to come into his own at linebacker for the Bears as well. So Aaron Rodgers' performance, perhaps not all that surprising. Surprising the Packers didn't go to the run a little bit more too in that game. Not a lot of production, but they had enough to win. And Aaron Rodgers was ecstatic about that Green Bay defense and Steve Penning's group there finally starting to come through. And so my takeaways in that game is the Chicago Bears, they may descend into a very difficult season. When you look at the Vikings coming up on the schedule, that's going to be a critical game for the Bears. And the Vikings, I wouldn't be surprised, could end up battling the Green Bay Packers for the top of the NFC North, whereas the Bears fall by the wayside. The reason I say that is if you're not going to get that takeaway production that the Bears got last year, and you've got a quarterback like Mitchell Trubisky who clearly is not progressing, certainly at the level of high draft pick like Trubisky should be progressing as. And I don't attribute any of that to the preseason and the lack of reps from the preseason. Just go back and look at the Los Angeles Rams last year. They didn't have a preseason. As far as their starters are concerned, they start off 9-0 and go to the Super Bowl. I know it's a little different with Trubisky because you're talking about a second-year player, but I think that's a cop-out. I think the problem you have is Trubisky might just not be good enough to play in the NFL at a high level. And if that's the case, and you're going to throw the football a lot, and Matt Nagy's not going to utilize a guy like David Montgomery, who they spent a high draft choice on, which was another mystifying development. They want Montgomery out of the backfield. He catches a ball for 25 yards, but he only rushes 6 times for 15 yards. That doesn't take the pressure off the quarterback position. It was a perfect storm against the Chicago Bears that rained down, I guess you could say, on that Bears offense, Trubisky, and it only got worse with the stubbornness of the play calling of Matt Nagy. So it makes you wonder if things are going to get better for the Bears if they don't get all of those takeaways. And that is an intangible you can never count on. Now, Chuck Pagano, as the defensive coordinator for the Bears, is going to call a much more aggressive game that for the Bears, and that might lend to takeaways. But if they don't get them, I think you're going to see a Bears team that could go 500 or below. You could see a Vikings team on the rise, and Green Bay may well be back. Aaron Rodgers healthy. He was very pleased, as I mentioned before, about that defense now that he knows he has. That's going to bring more confidence to that offensive side, of course. So I think Green Bay could all of a sudden become a playoff team. It may sound like I'm overreacting. It may sound like this is an overreaction, panicky, whatever, but I don't think so. I think the Bears are a team that are going to be declining this year. Also, we've got the very latest from Antonio Brown from our producer Cam Smith in Boston here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. And Cam tells me that now it comes out today from Albert Breer that Antonio Brown called Mike Mayock a cracker on Wednesday at practice, in addition to punting the football and inviting Mike Mayock, the beleaguered now general manager of the Oakland Raiders, inviting Mayock to fine him. So all hell is breaking loose now with the Raiders. And all of us out there, we couldn't be enjoying it more. I mean, Antonio Brown effectively hijacked the NFL yesterday, going into their historic 100th season with the ancient rivals, and I enjoyed every second of it. Now, there's a little concern in the back of your mind, perhaps about the mental health of Antonio Brown. Everybody, I think we're getting to the point, is thinking that. But as far as that situation goes, my impression is that nothing's going to happen and that Mike Mayock is going to have to eat it. He really is not going to be the person who prevails in this situation. And I think John Gruden gave us an indication of that yesterday when he was very, very non-committal in his remarks about Antonio Brown, about how much he loves Antonio Brown. He's frustrated by the situation. And John Gruden saying, I hope it works out. Essentially, that's code for I'm siding with Antonio Brown. Nothing's going to happen. People are talking about Antonio Brown's, they're talking about his bonus hanging in the balance, or his $30 million hanging in the balance. The deal that he has with the Oakland Raiders, there's no chance that he's going to lose that money. And I base it on the comments of John Gruden yesterday when he says, I hope it all works out. I don't think Mark Davis brings in John Gruden as the face of the franchise. He's paying Gruden that amount of money to side with Mayock. I think Mayock needs to step back and know his role in this situation. You also have to remember that the owner of the Raiders, Mark Davis, has always been a very, very friendly owner to players. It dates back to his youth. Of course, Mark Davis is the son of Al Davis, longtime NFL impresario and owner of the Oakland Raiders. But Mark Davis was a guy who would room with players, and he actually lived in an apartment for a time with the Raider legend Cliff Branch, who passed away recently. So that tells you about the perspective and the side, perhaps, that Mark Davis is taking behind the scenes, at least in this situation with Antonio Brown. So I've told you a couple of things here in the open of Sports by Brooks on Fancred that I want you to mark down. I want you to hold me accountable in that I'm telling you the Chicago Bears are in a decline. I would be surprised if they were over 500. In fact, they could end up a dumpster fire if they don't get the number of takeaways that they got last year. I think the Green Bay Packers could be a team on the rise, if not a playoff team, with the emergence of the defense. And that's right, by the way, Cam Smith, the producer, and messages me over our message board here. Mark Davis did indeed live with Cliff Branch. When he was younger. Al Davis was still running the team, his father. But so that gives you a hint, a little. I mean, that's why we're here, giving you a hint, giving you some insight here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. So we're interpreting things here for you, and we're telling you, and I could be wrong. Of course, there's always a possibility that AB gets suspended, AB loses his money, AB has his contract voided. I highly doubt it. In fact, I think if you're looking at Mike Mayock right now, you kind of wonder, is there a expiration date on his tenure with the Oakland Raiders? And here's the thing. You're not hearing anybody else say that for some reason. Maybe they're too close to the situation. Maybe they rely on access to these individuals, but I don't. And I'm someone who's been around long enough to be able to have the knowledge and the background of the situation, and then also be able to speak freely about it. And so I think that's what's going to play out with the Raiders. I think you're going to see, put it this way, I think Mike Mayock will be gone before Antonio Brown is gone, at least as it pertains to this season. When you look at the Raiders and you look at their fortunes this year, this is not a good team. This is not a playoff team. So if you're John Gruden and you're fighting for your life, at least he's not even fighting for his career. He's not fighting for his finances. He's going to be around after this year, regardless of how the season goes. But if they're going to make any progress in what is, pretty much a murderous division, even the Broncos are a team that is dangerous. If they want to make any strides this year, they're going to have Antonio Brown. I mean, they're really in a desperate state. When you talk about the Chargers, you talk about the Chiefs, they've got those teams both twice. It's an uphill battle for the Raiders. And when you have a guy like Mike Mayock out at practice and Antonio Brown losing his mind, essentially Mayock, is waving, the red cape in front of a bull, it appears. This is a bull ring situation. I think John Gruden has made it clear now that he is siding with Antonio Brown. We'll have to check in and see what happens, though, on that situation. And we may know more before the end of the show, so stay tuned. And I want you to come and join us every weekday, Monday through Friday, and we start at noon Eastern time on the dot. Coming up later, we hope to visit with Evan Silva. He's going to be joining us here shortly. Plus, we're also going to be talking to John Canzano of the Oregonian, not to mention Tim Ring. We're going to get the lowdown on Kyler Murray, in addition to Cliff Kingsbury and company, and perhaps some other Phoenix-based sports. I also want to talk a little about the LSU, Texas A&M, Clemson games. There's been a lot of speculation about the Texas A&M Texas rivalry over the last year or so, particularly in Texas. If you don't know already, Texas A&M and Texas, one of the longtime venerable rivalries in the history of college football. Those two teams never play, and they stopped playing. I mean, those two teams always used to play. Now they've stopped playing, and there's no indication that they're going to begin to start playing again. So the question is why? What happened? Why did they cancel that series a few years ago? And it came out of realignment. It came out of the situation in which Texas A&M ended up moving into the SEC. And you've got Texas hanging on to the Big 12, but essentially the Big 12 becomes almost a satellite system of the University of Texas, because Texas elects not to participate in a Big 12 network. That's why we don't have a Big 12 television network. You've got the Longhorn Network. ESPN enabled the University of Texas in that situation. And so that's why we wind up with no Big 12 network. And if you're wondering why Texas A&M doesn't stay in the Big 12, that's one of the big reasons. Because if Texas A&M sticks around in the Big 12, it became clear that Texas didn't view A&M or any of the other schools like, say, Nebraska or Missouri as partners. They wanted to do their own thing. They wanted to be on an island. So if you're Texas A&M, if you're Missouri, if you're Nebraska, and you want to compete with the top college football programs in the country, I mean, you've got to have that revenue. You've got to have the SEC type network revenue. And now when the SEC redoes their deal with CBS, if CBS is able to continue to broadcast SEC games, well, that's going to be a lot more money for SEC schools. And that goes into recruiting budgets. That goes into facilities. And we already know about the Big Ten network and that kind of revenue that goes into all the schools in the Big Ten. What that means for a school, let's say like Nebraska, if they're trying to continue to compete with the big boys, if Nebraska wants to get into the college football playoff. So you really don't have a choice if you're Nebraska, and to a certain extent Missouri. If you're sitting there and you're watching that money flow into the SEC, you're watching that money flow into the Big Ten, thanks to those network propositions, that television money from the ESPNs, from the Foxes. Fox is part of the big network, Big Ten network, and of course CBS as it pertains to the SEC. If you're Missouri and you're watching Texas say, we're not going to participate in a Big 12 network, I mean, what the hell are you going to do? You really have no choice but to look around. And so, of course, Missouri was courted by the Big Ten. You may remember this happened in the early 2010s. And then also you're looking at Texas A&M, you're looking at Nebraska, and they're trying to decide what to do. Nebraska being courted by the Big Ten. It's an absolute no-brainer that Nebraska would make that move. Oklahoma, different situation. They perhaps can stay a little more autonomous because they're able to generate the kind of revenue that a Nebraska or a Missouri on its own can't generate. But it was a natural thing for Missouri to go into the SEC geographically. Now they're a partner of Arkansas when you look at scheduling and logistics. And Missouri is extremely strong in the St. Louis market. When you look at the University of Kansas and the University of Missouri, essentially the University of Kansas is a Kansas City thing. KU, as it's called, Lawrence, Kansas, is about 20 minutes from Kansas City, whereas Missouri is in the middle of the state, and is much stronger on the eastern part of the state, really more of a function of St. Louis. That's why Illinois is a big rival to Missouri, and you'll see Missouri play Illinois in football and basketball every year. That's why that rivalry takes place. But Missouri also associates with the Confederate States, I guess you could say, going back in history. That's not exactly a pleasant reference, but I think Missouri does associate with the South to a certain extent more than we want to admit. So we'll get back to that subject. We'll get back to that topic because I want to delve deeper into the A&M Texas relationship. I was giving you the background on it. We'll continue that. But first, we want to bring up Evan Silva of EstablishTheRun.com. Evan is an OG of fantasy football. He's one of the most revered and admired figures in fantasy football. Hey, Evan, what's going on?
What's going on, Brooks? How you doing, man?
I'm doing great, man. And so are you excited about, obviously, the opening gun of NFL football? What was yesterday like for you?
It was pretty exciting. You know, the game itself was not super exciting. I mean, especially if you like offense and you like fantasy football. You know, the game itself was rough. I mean, both teams did play well defensively, but neither quarterback really played in the preseason. All that Mitch Trubisky for the Bears did in the preseason was hand off, and then Aaron Rodgers didn't even play a snap during the preseason. So I think that both, like offensively, both teams came out pretty rusty, and the Bears obviously have a great defense, and the Packers have a much improved defense. So we saw the results on the field, and not a lot of fireworks, but you know, we got a game under our belts, and I think we'll see a lot more fireworks on Sunday.
Yeah, and maybe I'm jumping. I mean, there's always overreaction, especially the first game of the season and a big buildup. But to me, this could be an indication of a changing of the guard in the division when you look at how the Bears team was fueled by takeaways. And that's kind of an intangible. No matter how good your defense is, you can't really count on that. And so they're going to be, it seems, more reliant on a Trubisky on a consistent basis. He comes out, and this is an abominable performance.
Yeah.
You know, do you think we could be see a changing of the guard where the Packers defense much improved and maybe the Packers ascend back to the top of the division and the Bears settle back down into 500 in that range?
Yeah, I mean, that's been kind of my expectation for the Bears. I mean, and that's, you know, the expectation at sportsbooks. I mean, you know, sportsbooks are not treating the Bears like a team that is a Super Bowl contender. I mean, they won 12 games last year. Their win total at sportsbooks is 9. I've kind of like leaned toward the under on that, you know.
Well, you just look at the line, you know, how close it was yesterday. Yeah. That was an indication, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's another really good point because, you know, 3 points is what you get just for being at home, and that was the spread. So sportsbooks considered the Packers and the Bears to be even though the Bears had a much better record last year than did the Packers. And look, there's a lot of room for growth potential for the Packers offense. You know, they have a new system there in place, and they need to figure some stuff out. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they should just let Aaron Rodgers run the show. You know, Matt LaFleur he wasn't successful in Tennessee. The only thing he really has on his resume that's impressive is the fact that he has coached with Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan before. And that's not really, you know, like great. You know, I mean, that's not much of a resume, just the fact that you have been exposed to, you know, other guys who are considered to be great offensive minds. And what he did last year in Tennessee was highly unimpressive. And I mean, you know, who knows more about football, Aaron Rodgers or Matt LaFleur? I mean, I think I'm going to go with Aaron Rodgers.
Is it possible that Aaron Rodgers might be a little undervalued, perhaps, or was he? Talk about that context, because you have your hand on the pulse in terms of what fantasy footballers are thinking going into the season, and maybe now this is indication with that defense that value could explode.
Yeah, you know, that's a good question, or that's a good kind of statement there, you know, like a good topic to discuss, because I would say that people were high on Aaron Rodgers entering the season, but man, recency bias affects so much. First of all, we only get 16 games, and so much stock is put into what happens early in the game. And that was an island game. Everyone watched that game, so there are going to be massive overreactions. I mean, that's something that I have to like try to work against myself, to not have massive overreactions to a game like that, because it's so easy to do. But the public's going to have massive overreactions to that. And, Aaron Rodgers is probably going to go from maybe even being a little bit overvalued before the season to now all of a sudden being undervalued. Devontae Adams, his number one receiver, didn't really have a big night either. These are kind of opportunities if you play in fantasy leagues to like send trade offers and try to buy low on these.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're talking to Evan Silva, and he's got the website Establish the Run, late of NBC Roto World. He's an OG in fantasy football. And when you look at what you do, and I see you sometimes address this, and I think it is a topic that's not discussed or explored enough when it comes to fantasy, and that is the coaches, and delving into the coaches. And is that how big a part of that is for how big are the coaches in understanding what they're going to do, studying their psychology? How much of that goes into fantasy football for you?
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, and I think that people know that. And it's like, you have to, all right. So Sigmund Bloom, who writes for Football Guys, is one of the best football analysts. He has this saying, the assumption of rational coaching. Okay. So we can make we can think what we think that the coaches should do. But then when we see what the coaches are doing,
right,
we can't fight against that. We can't fight against that. And I used to do this when I was like a younger fantasy analyst. I mean, all the time, and I fell into so many traps doing it. But you just have to take what the coaches are giving you almost, and then you kind of adjust.
There's a pragmatism to it.
Yeah, exactly. Don't be like, oh, well, I think that this guy's more talented, so I think that he's going to get more touches on Sunday. No, the coaches are dictating playing time, not what you think is as a rational thought process.
Right. So it's like you have to extract the word should out of your vocabulary completely, as it pertains to everything in fantasy football. Evan, talk to me a little bit about Establish the Run, because you're a guy who established Roto World, and you're a pivotal figure in fantasy football history as far as I'm concerned. But now you've got a new venture. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, worked at NBC Roto World for 10 or 12 years. Worked for 5 or 6 years with Adam Levitan, who then branched off and went to go work for DraftKings, and just absolutely crushed it at DraftKings. Worked for Fantasy Labs as well, and finally got the opportunity to kind of rejoin forces and start our own business called EstablishTheRun.com. And we had a draft kit before the season that I think was extremely, extremely helpful. Our number one player to avoid was Antonio Brown.
Wow.
Who right now looks like you really don't want any part of him. And our number one undervalued player was Allen Robinson, who went off for over 100 yards last night. So knock on wood, but we're off to a pretty decent start. And we covered preseason DFS, and we're going to cover in-season daily fantasy really, really hard. Like if you like to play at FanDuel or DraftKings, it's just the package would be extremely, extremely helpful.
So this is a subscription service, though, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so, and eventually we would love to make it free at some point, and we kind of have a little plan in place to make it free. I mean, obviously not this year and probably not next year, but maybe down the road. But yeah, I mean, this is what we're doing right now.
What is it about your product and what you do that you think lends to subscriptions? Because I know it's done well.
Yeah, I mean, just all the hard work that I put in, really not even necessarily just this year, but just over the years, and all the things that I've learned from making so many mistakes and learning from those mistakes, and just becoming better at what I do. Yeah. Yes, streamlining things, and I mean, oh my God, I made so many mistakes and learned from so many. I mean, I could go on and on about that. And then Adam Levitan he's the best daily fantasy analyst that there is, and he's also an amazing podcaster. And we're going to do multiple podcasts per week. And then we also have the best data analyst in media, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to football content. He also writes for 538. His name is Josh Hermsmeyer at Frisco Josh on Twitter, and also Pat Thorman, who worked for Pro Football Focus for a very long time. He's our specialist in terms of projecting how many plays per game a team is going to run. If a team runs more plays, they're going to have more opportunities to get to jam stats into the box score, and that's really an undercovered part of fantasy football analysis and projections. We also added Brandon Thorne, who is an amazing offensive line and defensive line analyst. And we believe that is also an undercovered aspect of fantasy football. How do the ways that the defensive line and the offensive line, especially when you inject injuries into situations, how the defensive line and the offensive line interact and how they can affect skill position players. Like, hey, if we're missing our starting right tackle this week, the tight end might have to block more. Or we might have to shorten our route depths and throw more to our slot receivers and our tight ends and our running backs this week instead of airing it out deep, because our offensive line is in bad shape. So just all that kind of stuff.
It's amazing. What's interesting about the gambling talk and the betting talk, and that's kind of a revelation right now because it's becoming legalized in different states and it's progressing. And it's getting more popular. But, I think even having a discussion and talking about fantasy versus gambling and betting, fantasy is like endemic now in our society.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a man. It could be a woman. Anybody who is watching NFL football, I mean, the percent chance, on a consistent basis, the percent chance that they're going to be in some manner of fantasy league is very, very high. And the idea that's not going away. And I mean, gambling and betting, that to me, that only makes it stronger.
Yeah. With fantasy football, I mean, and it's growing every year. It's not, I would say that daily fantasy has kind of leveled off. There was kind of like a really hot period where if you were just kind of putting in a little bit more work than everyone else, when there are a lot of like beginning players, you had a much better chance to win. Now the edges are a little bit smaller. People kind of woke up, they lost their money. Like, I'm not doing that anymore. So daily.
Well, guys like you became more prevalent. You educated people.
Right. I like to think that, but no, but I mean, it's kind of leveled off a little bit, but I think that the number of people, and there's still like kind of untapped markets, like women are very much starting to get more into fantasy football. I mean, it's much likelier right now.
It's a social thing, I think it lends to females.
Absolutely. And I mean, women watch football, like let's not pretend that they don't. And, more and more, women are getting into fantasy football. So it's like very much a growing industry. And it's a great industry to be in. And, I try to help young dudes that are, kind of trying to come up. And, if you just work hard, I mean, you can absolutely, kind of grow your brand and make your stamp in the industry. And it's a great industry to dive in, even if you're just kind of doing it on the side, maybe start your own podcast with your buddy, or, maybe start your own blog, it's a great industry to be in.
It's like, I think people, they rule out themselves. Don't underestimate anything. Don't underestimate your own ability to get insight. Like you're watching something and you see something and you say to yourself, I mean, that's kind of the story of my career too. It's like, you may be the person who sees it. No one else sees it, whatever that context that is. But what's fascinating to me, what really, really draws me to fantasy is the social aspect of it. And people talk about a Facebook, social media, Instagram as a way to keep track of your friends and your family. But let's say your friends. I think fantasy is probably more prevalent than social media for a lot of people as they, keep track of people in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've never asked you the question of, I remember you just like in the very, very early days of Twitter, and I never asked you, or I never like knew like just, where you came from,
Right.
And I just all of a sudden like started following you, and you were just a really interesting follow, I don't know. Have you told that story? I'd love to listen to the story.
Off and on. That's why we're doing this,
Yeah.
the Sports by Brooks on Fancred. And I'm going to talk more about that. But I think, I'm originally a broadcaster, longtime talk show guy. And in 2000, I just got into the internet when everybody had left.
Mm-hmm.
And I started seeing things that were online. This is at the beginning of sports media on the internet with the newspapers, and they were giving this stuff away for free. So I started to aggregate a lot of the stuff that I thought was good into one spot. And then because I have a sports background, and I think this is why I kind of stuck out, is I was doing real sports. I was breaking real sports and sports media news to an extent. And I'm also somebody that when we have this conversation, and I think, Evan, you have to have some sort of philosophical outlook and overriding confidence, almost like you yourself are a force of nature that you can, when you start your own website, millions of people start their own website, but the people who ultimately succeed really believe they can do it. They may not verbalize that, and they may not always admit that to themselves, but there's always that inner belief that you can do something extraordinary. So it kind of speaks, and maybe you picked up on me saying that earlier. It lends to when I'm watching something or I'm thinking about something, there's a good chance that you really are right and everybody else is wrong, or you're seeing something, or there's an opening in a business or a business model, and you're right. The key is you have to believe that. And I think to a certain extent, you're born with it. And so what you saw, I think, with me on Twitter was an outcropping of that. My personality. I had this unique background in sports, and now I have this voice on Twitter. And I'll say this. I always say this about myself, and it's a football analogy. You can't scheme for me. You never know what you're going to get. And so if I hang around long enough, I'll do something on pro football, and then the pro football guys will be like, who is this guy? But I do it long enough, and then they start, yeah, cool. This guy does know what he's doing. Yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah. That's cool how you almost have like that great self-awareness too, because I couldn't even have described it better, as just viewing you, that you have like a great sense of self-awareness, and, just that level, like not cockiness, but like just that level of like self-confidence that you kind of know that, you realize that.
And then what I think really, really cuts through the noise is not being contrived. And because today in sports media, on ESPN and FS1, everything is so staged, everything is so phony and contrived, right? And propaganda, that's the business model there. That's what it's all about. It really is propaganda. So I think if you have something that's original, that you don't force, it's not contrived, and you're consistent with it, people respond to it. But you just have to, here's the thing. On Twitter is such a numbers-based thing. That's how you're judged, whether it's your followers, whether it's a retweet or a like. The most important thing to understand is you can put out an incredible effing tweet, and just because it only gets 10 likes or 2 likes, it doesn't make it less incredible. It's the same principle, Evan, as everybody in media tells you that people have short attention spans. They don't have short. What they want is to be engaged. They want to be entertained. It's like the Jackie Robinson footage I put up, which I need to send you, of him playing football, where he looks like Reggie Bush looked like in college, right? That's a 2-minute clip. And it's leather helmet football, but everybody I know is going to watch it, and they don't even know it's Shaq Robinson. So the key to me is to recognize when people say, "Oh, everybody has a short attention span," or they're cynical and stuff. It's not true. It's not true. And I think what you've done, I mean, you talk about swimming upstream. You're like that salmon you see in the documentary with Establish the Run.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're doing is genius. I mean, everything you're telling me right down to the details right now shows why it's working, and that millions and millions of hours you put into it. But it's not enough. I've heard you talking about working hard, and that's critical. You've got to have that, but you have to work smart.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you guys have done. And that's why you're successful. And that's why you have the following you have. So, but it's been great talking to you. And hopefully we can touch base and we're being philosophical right now. I really appreciate that. But maybe touch base, once in a while during the season and keep it rolling.
Absolutely, man. Yeah. When those bye weeks start to set in, and, you got like 4 or 6 teams on bye, it's like a vacation. I mean,
right.
Because you don't have to worry about those teams. You don't have to worry about all the injuries, for those teams. And let's do it. Let's do it when the bye weeks start to set in.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. I mean, like I'll go to a movie. I'll take a nap. It's nice, man. It's like
do the show. Yeah.
Yeah. But all right. Thanks so much for having me.
Right. I appreciate it, Evan. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, man.
That's Evan Silva, EstablishTheRun.com. And as you can see, great guy, and someone who is proving that just you as an individual, you can start your own thing and you can do anything. I think the key to it, more than anything, is you got to believe in yourself. And that's such a cliche. But if you read Ralph Waldo Emerson's Self-Reliance, go grab that. It's like 23 pages. It's a text file. You can get it on the internet. Ralph Waldo Emerson's Self-Reliance. Grab that and read it, and it will get your blood pumping like in about 25 seconds. So we're going to be visiting with John Canzano coming up. He is John Canzano, of course, of the Oregonian. He is a major figure in the Pacific Northwest, and so we're going to talk to him about Oregon football, the state of the Pac-12. We'll talk briefly, not much to talk about when it comes to Oregon State. We're going to do all of that coming up with John Canzano. And then later on, we're going to travel over to Phoenix, and we're going to get the lowdown on Kyler Murray as well. So, and what's going on with the Arizona Cardinals, what's going on with some of the things in terms of college football, and maybe delve into the Diamondbacks as well in the National League West. And as it pertains to the playoff picture, the wild card, they've had some crazy games with the Dodgers of late. So stick around for that. But I want to revisit the topic that we brought up earlier involving Texas A&M and Texas, because they have discontinued their rivalry. And I mentioned this on Twitter, and it got quite a response. So I wanted to make sure that I addressed it for everybody out there, because I know there's quite a few people that I'm just over here refreshing. Quite a response. So I know you guys are out there today, and I appreciate you tuning in. You need to stick around. Come here. We're going to be here every day, Monday through Friday, noon Eastern time, 2 hours. You're going to hear a lot from me about college football, but I'm not just college football. We're going to do pro football. You heard Evan Silva. We're going to have him on quite a bit, and it's going to be a unique show, just like the takes we had earlier today, where we were talking about how we may see a changing of the guard with the Packers and the Bears. I know the lines are kind of pointing to that way. The props are, but I think you may see the Packers going to the top of the division, and you may see the Bears settling down into the middle, perhaps being usurped by the Minnesota Vikings. I wouldn't be surprised that this is the moment. I mean, Matt Nagy to be so out of it yesterday. I don't know, maybe he'll learn from him, but doesn't sound like it from his comments after the game as far as the Bears are concerned. And so I wanted to get back into this Texas A&M thing, because I don't think people, at least for me personally, for a long time, I looked at Texas and Texas A&M equally as to the blame for those two teams not playing, because that, I think, is a game that college football needs. I think the sport needs it, right? But when you have a Texas that is essentially the school that basically broke up the Big 12 and essentially drove Texas A&M out of the Big 12 to the SEC, Nebraska to the Big 10, Missouri to the SEC. I really, at this point, I didn't always look at it that way, but I do now. After doing a deep dive on it, I really believe, all things being equal, that the establishment of the Longhorn Network, which was enabled by ESPN, that led to the downfall of the Big 12. And we're going to talk about this, by the way, with John Canzano. We're going to talk about the prospect of an Oklahoma maybe going to the Pac-12. That might be something up the sleeve of Pac-10, or I should say Pac-12 Commissioner Larry Scott. Maybe they look to put together a Pac-16, something of that nature, as they scoop up some of those attractive, perhaps Mountain West schools. Maybe they go back to the well there. Maybe they go to the Big 12. But I think that's kind of an inevitability when you think about where the Big 12 is, when you have schools like Oklahoma that they just can't abide being in that arrangement where they're watching the SEC network and the Big 10 network and the television rights coming up for the SEC, meaning tens of millions of dollars every year for all the schools in those conferences. So when you look at the videos of the new LSU locker room, or you look at just in general, the facilities now at Texas A&M, a lot of that is the function of accounting for the revenue flow from the SEC. That would not be happening if A&M was still in the Big 12. And why is this all taking place? It all emanates out of Austin, Texas. It emanates out of DeLoss Dodd's decision, the former AD at Texas, to create the Longhorn Network, which has been nothing short of a financial disaster, a money pit for ESPN. But in that situation, if you're A&M and you have a partnership, so to speak, with Texas, at least when it comes to playing each other in all sports, and you see Texas saying, we're going to create a Longhorn Network with ESPN that's going to preclude a Big 12 network, and you're looking over at the Big 10 and the SEC network, you have no choice, because you're not going to get that revenue from the Big 12 network television arrangement, right? It doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist because of Texas. So you have to take a look at the SEC. And you know what? The SEC is a much more natural fit for Texas A&M than you might imagine. In fact, when you think about LSU for the longest time, and of course, charter member of the SEC, that's a whole nother story. We'll talk about the LSU football program and the role the infamous Governor Huey Long had in helping to create that program and build that stadium and create the marching band and write the lyrics to Tiger Rag. That was Huey Long. We'll get into that at some point. But so LSU, really one of the flagship schools of the SEC. And I don't know, Cam, by the way, if you want to go to comments, if we want to go to some folks on the fan line, I should have taken this opportunity to mention, for all of you who are watching me right now as we talk about Texas A&M and Texas and that rivalry, the deceased rivalry and the situation going on there. If you want to join me on the fan line, we can pull you up on the screen. Take a look at the fan line button that's on the screen, top right corner of the box that you're watching me in, and touch that box, click on that box, and it'll bring you up and we'll talk some ball. So go ahead and do that here on the Fancred app, and we'll get that rolling. I was remiss in mentioning that, but you can certainly join us online here as we talk about A&M and Texas And a little bit of what we were talking about earlier as it pertains to the Pac-12, as we are joined now by John Canzano of the Oregonian, and he has a radio show in Portland. He does weekdays Monday through Friday. John, I really appreciate you joining us. Appreciate you coming on. And how are you doing today?
I'm great, man. I love the new format. I love that you're out there.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And now today we're chopping it up, Texas A&M. And I'm so glad you're with us because we were just talking about the Pac-12 and the situation now where the Pac-12 is in a desperate state, right? Financially, because of the television situation. And when you look at the Big 12, you could make an argument the Big 12 is in a somewhat similar state, right? Because of the Longhorn Network being the elephant in the room. So do you still think there's a prospect that Larry Scott, the commissioner of the Pac-12, may look at an Oklahoma, may look at some of the Mountain West schools and play those cards, expand the Pac-12 and try to reignite interest in a Pac-12 network or a Pac-16 network?
I think they've got to do something at some point, right? Because they've fallen behind. And I know that when they realigned the last time and they took Utah and Colorado, they looked pretty hard at Texas, and that Longhorn Network was a big problem for them, and they couldn't get that by. I think what first has to happen is, they're trying to do this private equity thing where they're, it's essentially a Hail Mary by Larry Scott, who's late in his contract, that, he's trying to get some private equity firm to infuse $500 million worth of capital and help them catch up because, in this 10-year cycle that they're on, every single Pac-12 university is going to be $100 million behind every university in the SEC. And that kills Washington State and Oregon State, and it kills Arizona. Outliers like Oregon can get by because they've got a Phil Knight. But I think you're absolutely right, Brooks. Like after that, the Pac-12 will have to come to a realization of either they're going to catch up and they're going to get somebody to partner with, or they have to kind of look at realigning and who becomes attractive to them. And I think that cycle could be 5 or 7 years out.
Yeah, it looks like when I talked to you about Oklahoma and the prospect of expanding, that could have been a Hail Mary for Larry Scott, but he's now going this private equity route. What do you think is going to happen ultimately?
Well, I don't think they're going to get what they think. Their valuation of the network being worth $5 billion is absurd. I mean, they're not a media company. They can say they're a media company the same way I can say I'm a movie star, right? I'm not a movie star just because I say I am. Look, you have to, if you're the Pac-12, you have to look at this 2024, their media contracts expire. They're going to have to re-up. And I really do think they should partner with a real media company like ESPN or partner with Amazon or somebody who can take them streaming because their distribution sucks, which ultimately hurts their revenue streams. And you watch them fall behind. They keep saying, hey, the best part of this is we're going to control our media rights in 2024. Well, okay, 2024 is like light years. That's like saying, hey, we're scheduling Alabama in 2024. Nobody pays attention to that. That's so far away. Right now, actor.
Well, it's really interesting to see the whole coverage that you've done, John. It's been phenomenal. The topics and the subjects that we're talking about, we wouldn't be talking about many of them without you and the journalism that you put into it via the Oregonian. What kind of pushback have you gotten, not only from Larry Scott, but around the Pac-12?
Well, getting a lot of support, right? From the member institutions. They're all frustrated because I'm writing about it. Fans knew something was wrong. Everybody knew something was wrong, but they couldn't put their finger on what exactly is it. Is it, all the players? We don't recruit as well. But I mean, it's a financial disadvantage that the conference is at. And I'm getting a lot of university presidents who have reached out to me, athletic directors as well, who have reached out to me privately to talk about their frustrations. They are now presenting a unified front, though. They're all saying, look, we're in this together. We've got to find a way out of this if we're the Pac-12. And the way out of it is not to, for them to batter Larry Scott. But I think fans are now over him and the conference itself. It's really interesting, Brooks, you know this. Out of all the words that I wrote, out of 10,000 words that I wrote about the conference in this series, the Pac-12 conference had no problem no, didn't ask for corrections, didn't ask for clarification. They just accepted. They can't argue with the facts, right? The numbers are wrong. So what I'm getting back from them, and I've talked to Larry Scott, I ran into him during the NCAA tournament, off to the side as I was waiting for Oregon to play Virginia in the Sweet 16. And I said, Larry, it's not personal. And he said, well, it sure feels personal. And I said, man, that is a really narrow way to look at things. I mean,
hold on. Wait,
yeah.
Hold on, John.
Yeah.
Some of the hotel rooms, some of that stuff. I mean, I'm not saying it was personal. I'm saying you, from Larry's perspective, I'm not on Larry's side.
Yeah.
But Larry is responsible for that ridiculous large S. He's absolutely responsible. And you took it to the next level with your reporting. So I will say that to an extent, I'm not going to let you know I'm not on Larry's side, but you can kind of understand where he's coming from.
Yeah, totally. But I just thought it was interesting that he felt like this was an attack on him by me to the point where I'm saying, Larry, let's do it.
It wasn't about him, though.
It's not about you. Like, all I care about, like, look, I want to cover Pac-12 and the college football playoff. I'd love to see the teams here be, every year make the playoff. The conference is doing well. And if they're not, then it's the coach's fault or it's the AD's fault. But right now, I have a hard time looking at, let's look at Oregon State. I have a hard time looking at Oregon State and going, well, you're underachieving when I see the financial disparity that they're at.
Yeah, I mean, that's when you look at Texas A&M, you look at Nebraska, you look at Missouri, and I was just talking about this. They had no choice. When Texas went to the Longhorn Network, they precluded a Big 12 network. They precluded John Skipper of ESPN writing them a ridiculously enormous check. They precluded any big live play-by-play agreement for the Big 12. And so suddenly Texas A&M is sitting here, and it's a little bit like Oregon State. Texas A&M more prominent in football somewhat, but what's Texas A&M going to do? I'm going to sit here and let Texas make all this money. When I can go over to the SEC, be a natural rival with LSU. Now you look at Oregon State, but not just Oregon State, all those schools, the enormous financial disparity. And now we talk about the Big 12 and say, why aren't they in the college football playoff? Why are they losing to all of these lower level of FBS and FCS schools? Well, a big reason is they don't have the resources.
Yeah, they don't have the resources. And then further, they've got some academic requirements that, some of the mid-majors, I've covered those programs. They can take non-qualifiers. They can take more junior college players. And so they're
Would you put Nevada in that category?
Yeah, but I think, and I think they become dangerous.
Very dangerous.
Yeah, I covered Fresno State when Pat Hill was the coach and David Carr was the quarterback, and he had NFL wide receivers like Bernard Berrien, who went to the Bears, and you got the #1 pick in the draft. And that team was dangerous. Like, they couldn't have gone in and won the Pac-12, or they couldn't have won the Big 12, but they could have beat anybody on a given Saturday. And that is a tough non-conference matchup for a Big 12 or a Pac-12 opponent.
John Canzano is joining us, eminent journalist from the Oregonian, and also a weekday talk show host in Portland. And I want to get into Oregon. I mentioned Nevada, and they've got an interesting game. And when you look at Nevada, we always have known that was going to be a tough game, but now it's a lot more urgent for Oregon, not only to win that game coming up on Saturday, but also perhaps make a statement, because when you talk about the Auburn loss, you're not talking about an elite SEC school, at least right now in football. I think Auburn's probably going to be a 4-loss team. So that loss by Oregon, it's a little deceiving. I think people say, whoa, they barely lost. Still, it was a close. It's not going to look so good later in the year when Auburn has all those L's. What about this Nevada game?
Yeah, this is. I texted with Mario Cristobal this morning, and I said to him, "This is a big game for him." And I don't think it's hyperbole. Like, they have to make a statement. They have to,
especially in lieu of the Purdue thing.
Oh yeah,
with Nevada.
At home against Nevada. This is a team, like, if you go back to 2011, okay, and 2011 was a big year for Oregon football, right? You had Chip Kelly still at Oregon. They opened the season very much like this Oregon team this season. They played LSU that year at AT&T Stadium, Jerry World, and that Oregon team lost at that LSU game. came back and played Nevada in the second week of the season and absolutely laid it on Nevada. Scored 60-plus points, embarrassed them. It was a statement game. That Oregon team goes on to play in the Rose Bowl, beats Wisconsin and Russell Wilson. I'm looking at this year's team, and I'm saying, look, if this year's team is going to have a season that we all expect with a quarterback who's a top 10 pick in the NFL draft, they've got to come out this Saturday against Nevada at home with a statement. I texted something like that to Mario Cristobal. He came back with absolutely, and I know he was angry after the Auburn game. And you're right, Brooks. Like, if they'd beat Auburn, that would have been a nice win for them, a physical win. It would have been a win over an SEC team. It would have set them up nicely. But I think you're right. I think Auburn's going to lose 4 games this year, and Oregon's going to end up looking back on that and going, should we have played that game? Should maybe we had opened up with somebody a little softer?
Well, I just look back at the Auburn game, and I'm a Georgia guy, and the more I look at it, and Bo Nix, they could be a 5-loss team. So, I mean, it's just ugly to think about. And then when you look at the Pac-12 in general, and that's really the marquee game in the non-conference, how far has the conference fallen? So I also want to ask you, though, when you talk about the demise of the Pac-12, and we talk about the disparity in resources, it's easy to say they don't have the recruiting budget. They don't have the money for those LSU locker rooms where you look like it's Star Trek, right? Well, of course, Oregon does, but nobody else does, not in the Pac-12.
That's interesting that you point that out, because I feel like this era is ripe for an outlier, right? And who are the outliers in the conference? It's Mike Leach at Washington State, who just does it a little different. He makes more with less. He's his own offensive coordinator, so he doesn't have to hire a high-priced offensive coordinator. He's an outlier, and guess what? He's winning. You've got Oregon over my shoulder here. They've got Phil Knight. They're not as reliant upon that money, so they're an outlier. You've got Washington and Chris Peterson, who kind of rose up as USC was in trouble, and they've got it going, and I think everybody's benefiting from USC being down. But it's those 3 schools right now where I go, they have to be going, hey, we have a huge advantage over the rest of the conference.
Well, I mean, what's stopping them, you think, from taking advantage of that opportunity to this point? I mean, there's still Washington. Let's go back and think about Washington as a football program. This is one of the greatest college football programs tradition-wise of the 20th century, thanks to Don James. Yet Washington, and they've got Chris Peterson, and we're getting the fits and starts. So what is it about a program like Washington that's holding them back, you think, right now?
I think some of the conference as well, because one of the other things we didn't talk about is, they've decided they're going to play 9 conference games. All right. Yeah. The SEC plays 8. So you've got one more week every season where, Washington has to play Stanford.
What's the thought process behind that?
Their thought process is they want home games. They want those home games. They want to play each other, but they're not thinking about, if you're gaming the college football system, you've got to play 8 because when you play 9, you're going to set yourself up for losses. Also, you've got half the conference has to play 5 conference road games this year. Nobody in the SEC will play 5 conference road games. So, last year I look at it, the game I look at is, Washington State has to play Washington in the snow. And I kept thinking to myself, gosh, if they were in the SEC, would that game even be on the schedule, or would it? Or maybe they'd have one less conference game. So I think they just set themselves up for even the best teams in the conference can't seem to get by the rest of the conference. They suffer that one loss and nobody respects the conference. So it ends up looking like a bad loss. And all of a sudden we're on our 3rd season here where I don't think they're going to get a playoff team 3 years in a row.
Oregon State with a game playing Hawaii coming up. But I know Oregon State's football program certainly is down. But watching them, what was your impression of the Oklahoma State game? First off, I want to get your first blush reaction.
Well, I think if you're an Oklahoma State fan, you've got an elite offense. I mean, their wide receiver core, their offense, phenomenal offense. That's first takeaway. Oregon State fans, since Gary Anderson left this program mid-season, 2 seasons ago, just took off mid-season. The program was, now on its 3rd head coach since Mike Riley. You've got, their defensive players are just not on par with the peers that they're playing. I think Hawaii is going to put up 45 on them. I mean, I just, yeah, we don't have any proof that defense can stop anybody, Brooks.
This is looking like the worst major college football program I've ever seen in my life in person was the Paul Wolf Washington State teams. And honest to God, watching Oregon State play, I watched the SC game last year. They're not a Pac-12 team. The level of talent is not there. Maybe it is this year. Maybe it's getting better. Maybe I'm wrong. But, I mean, we're sinking down. Or are we? Are they that bad?
I think their offense is going to be fine.
Okay.
That's why, I was looking at that game. The over-under on that game on Saturday night is 78.5.
That could be a fun game then.
That could be a really fun game to watch if you and I could watch it, Brooks, because guess what? It's not on ESPN. It's not on Fox. It's not on the Pac-12 network.
My God.
It's not on you got to watch it on Facebook. You got to watch it on
Shut
Facebook.
Up. So, quit lying.
No, it's on Facebook. It's only on Facebook. And you can get it on pay-per-view if you're in Hawaii, but it's only on Facebook. And I called the Pac-12 and I said, what's your position on this? And they said, well, the home team gets the broadcast rights, but Oregon State plays 4 Mountain West Conference opponents in the next 7 years. And if I have to watch them on Facebook 4 times in the next 7 years, I think that's a huge disadvantage. And now if I'm recruiting against them, that's going to hurt them. So I think, lucky for them, maybe it's on Facebook, but I think that game's got 45-40 written all over it. I mean, it's going to be a fun game to watch, but you got to stream it.
We're talking to John Canzano. He's a weekday talk show host on 750 The Game in Portland, also an eminent journalist for the Oregonian. I want to talk now about the programs down here in Los Angeles. Get your impression, John, of USC particularly. And, I'm starting to think, when you think about the ACC, all right, think about it, the ACC without Dabo Swinney. It's essentially a one-man conference, not a one-school conference, but a one-man conference. Without Dabo Swinney, we would be lumping the ACC in with the Pac-12. We would be talking about what I was talking about a couple of days ago, where should we not call this the Power Five anymore? Should we move Mountain West up or something? But I think that's where the ACC is. Now, that in mind, let's think about Urban Meyer. What if Urban Meyer comes to USC? I'm not saying it's going to be Dabo Swinney impact, but maybe I am saying that, right? I mean, what kind of impact could that have?
Well, it certainly would be a high profile or higher. And I think USC is the, it's that tent pole that hasn't delivered. Because you remember, Brooks, even when SC played Texas for the national championship, the viewpoint of the Pac-10 at that point was, hey, it's USC and then everybody else. It's the same as the ACC and Clemson. The conference needs USC to be good. And the fact that, we're sitting here watching Clay Helton again, on the hot seat. How hot is the seat? I felt bad for him at Media Day. I thought, this is like the Green Mile. I mean, it was like Dead Man Walking. Like, this is not going to happen for USC, and they'll end up making a change. But I don't know if you think Urban could pull that off. You think that he could say,
John, he was so dominant at Ohio State. I'm not saying, there's so much baggage, all right, but understand, think about the baggage at USC and what they get away with and what college football gets away with like no other sport. College football is not held accountable. They hide behind, well, we've got the kids here, right? So the coaches get away with, dare I say, murder. But when you think about somebody like Urban Meyer, if ever there was someone in a position to make a monster splash and put an entire conference on his back in that media market, in the context of USC with all the everlasting scandal, this is like a perfect, I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a moral thing, but I think this could be a redux of the ACC, but the Pac-12, I think, still is a sleeping giant when you look at Oregon, and you mentioned Washington. You got the guy up at Washington State. You got Stanford. You bring in an Urban Meyer, and that's a lightning bolt that comes in.
Yeah, you hit on something there because, I kept thinking about the money and what he was making at Ohio State. And part of the financial disadvantage that you have is the fact that you can't pay your coaches as much. Chris Peterson's the highest paid coach in the Pac-12. I think he's 18th nationally among Power 5 coaches. So, you barely have a top 20 paid head coach, and your assistant coaches, Oregon and Washington pay their assistants more than anybody, and they're still nowhere near what the assistants are getting paid in the SEC. So that trickles down. So the question is, Urban could come to USC. I don't think he's going to get Ohio State money, and maybe he's damaged goods to the point where like he'd just be happy to have a job and get back in it.
John, what's damaged goods in college football? There's no such thing.
Yeah. Amen.
It really isn't. And I talked about perfect storm. It's USC. Look what's gone on there. Look at the college admission scandal. Look at the problems they've had outside of sports there. And look at a guy like Rick Caruso, the billion. Look at the people like Wayne Hughes. He's the guy that's going to be making the call, the billionaire booster. I just feel like, you know what? There's too much humanity in you, John. You know what I mean? That's the thing. Of anybody who covers the sport, you're seeing I'm kind of the cynic, right? I'm the pragmatist. But I've covered Urban, covered Ohio State. You know this. I've covered Oregon. Yeah. If anybody was poised, and here I think the indication that it will succeed is that nobody is talking about the fact that Fox hired him. He's like on this holding pattern, and he's doing a show with a guy. This is unbelievable. I mean, this is happening. But Reggie Bush is on that show. He's banned from the campus, and they have OJ's Heisman inside Heritage Hall. And, they put the OJ banner up inside the stadium for, I guess, the first game at the Coliseum. And Reggie Bush is persona non grata. So to me, the moral of the story is there is no moral, I guess, but is anything, and I mean anything, is possible.
Yeah, and look, you're at desperation too if you're USC, because you have been left behind since Pete Carroll left, and I think the athletic department's been a mess. You got the university president who's passed the buck, an interim president. Now you've got Lynn Swann and all that mess. And so, if you're USC, you're at desperation point, and Urban Meyer might be their way out. Brooks, you're onto something there.
Well, I think he is going to be the way out, and it's going to be what I look forward to. What I can't wait, John, is talking to you on your show and on this show, Sports by Brooks on Fancred, after Urban Meyer comes into play. And to be honest, if I'm Larry Scott, I mean, I am hiring a private jet. I am hiring a car to get Urban to USC. So I hope you'll stay in touch. Hope you come on again, John, because it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Love it, man. Great format. Glad that you're out there, Brooks. Thanks, man.
Thanks so much. That's John Canzano. He's the greatest. He's at the Oregonian. He's a great follow. I hope you watch him on Twitter and take a look at his timeline, because there's no better person out there holding people accountable, doing the real journalism. He has single-handedly informed the public about what's going on with the Pac-12, and he has really informed the situation when it comes to the downfall of the Pac-12, why it struggles the way it struggles in terms of competitiveness, because you have resources at Oregon, and we talked about resources at Washington. You've got them at USC, but wait a minute. You don't have the kind of money they have at the SEC network, and with the upcoming SEC redo of their television deal with CBS. Now, that money hasn't necessarily all come in yet, but it's accounted for, and that's why you get the facilities that you get at the University of Georgia, at LSU, at Texas A&M, which is where I want to go back to here in a second as I reset for you. I should have brought this up to John. We just got this from Jeff in our comments. Our comments here, Sports by Brooks on Fancred. And I want to remind you, if you want to join me, we're going to get to this. This is a work in progress. This is a new show. Fancred is cutting edge technology for the fan. So it's going to allow for you to be able to listen to that conversation. And then we're going to come in and we're going to take your comments. We're going to pull you up with us here on the fan line. All you got to do is touch the button in the top right corner of your screen. You can participate in the conversation if you're an Oregon fan, or you're a Pac-12 school fan, or maybe you're a Texas A&M fan, Texas, whatever it may be. It doesn't matter. We'll be doing pro football as well. I want you to participate in this conversation. here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred, and I'm glad you're joining us. But to get back to Jeff's comment, Arash Markazi of the Los Angeles Times joined us yesterday, and he is a guy who knows USC football like nobody's business. And he thinks that Bob Stoops, I don't know if you heard about that, Ryan. Bob Stoops, maybe you may have heard that yesterday. Well, Arash is just throwing that out. He's a homer, but maybe that's not the case. But Bob Stoops, we'll have to start floating that out there. In fact, Cam, I don't know if we cut that. You probably already did it, but we probably should cut that and put that up on Twitter from the show. Arash Markazi talking about Bob Stoops. That sounds like a situation where Arash might want to fly out. You might want to fly out. What is Bob Stoops? He's coaching like the Dallas team in the XFL. Maybe Arash goes out there and stirs it up for the old Trojans. But Bob Stoops and Urban Meyer. And I'll say this much. I remember when Bob Stoops left Oklahoma, it was pretty clear that it wasn't all his choice when they brought on Lincoln Riley, but they made the right call with the coaching and waiting. Usually that doesn't work, but it did work certainly in Oklahoma's case. And now we're going to see what happens to Bob Stoops. That's a storyline in the XFL. Cam, we may need to get somebody, Cam Smith, our producer in Boston here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. We need to talk to some XFL people. We need to talk, whether it's Oliver Luck or whether it's Bob Stoops, or it's people that are running some of those franchises that maybe aren't, all over the place. But I want to start tracking the XFL because I think we want to get ahead of it in that you could have some high school football stars end up at the XFL electing to play a season or three with that league before perhaps the big money that they get with the NFL. The AAF was all about affiliating with the NFL, and it was started, I think, with the intention of being a minor league feeder system to the NFL. Unfortunately for the Ebersol family, Charlie and Dick, they didn't account for that nearly enough, and it was a financial disaster that it was of incalculable size. So but the XFL, it may or may not be different. I like the Pac Pro model that Tom Brady's agent, Don Yee, is proposing, which would entail a special league of sorts that would be based out here on the Pacific Coast. And this is still in play, where you would have high school players going into a league, and it would be a developmental league. They would be paid a nominal salary, and that would help get them ready for the NFL in lieu of college football. So that's something that we want to look at too, Pac Pro, because I know Pac Pro has hired some people that are now running that league out of Don Yee's office, again, the agent for Tom Brady. But coming up here in about 10 minutes, we're going to be joining Tim Ring out in Phoenix of ABC 15. And Tim has been there well over a decade. I've known him a long time. And we're going to talk about Kyler Murray, who's kind of flying under the radar. I get the feeling that people are thinking this might be a disaster with Cliff Kingsbury, but who knows? It'll be fun to watch no matter what, providing, Murray has a modicum of protection from that offensive line. And we'll also talk to him a little bit about the Arizona State team with Herm Edwards. What's the status of that team? I mean, is Herm doing a decent job? Is that a team that could, possibly be, I'm not going to say run the table, but maybe be in the upper reaches of the league? So we'll talk about that with Tim Ring coming up. I want to revisit and go back to the subject before we visited with John Canzano about Texas and Texas A&M, because I know earlier we sent out a tweet on that on Fancred, and I got a huge response. I know some of you are out there. And if you want to join me on the fan line, I want to specifically mention this to A&M and Texas fans. If you're a Texas fan, if you're an A&M fan, I want to encourage you to, if you're watching the show, we've got a fan line button. You can click on that button, talk to our producer, Cam Smith, and we'll bring you up, because I legitimately am interested in your opinion, because it's a very complicated issue. A&M and Texas not playing anymore. It's an important issue because it's important for the sport, in my mind, for those teams to play. But it really is understandable from Texas A&M's side of it. For a long time after the teams decided to initially not play, once that first stage of realignment began in 2012, you could certainly hang it on Texas as to why they weren't playing. But now I think in the latest round of the media coverage, just in the last year, it's become obvious that Texas A&M has no interest. There's not really an upside. I mean, you've got the legislature involved. You've got polls being taken. And clearly on the campus of A&M, on the campus of UT at Austin, you have students that would like to see that game played. And it's not the end of the world that it's not played. But when it comes to the older folks who are informed about the realignment situation, understand what the position was of Texas after Texas A&M and Texas initially decided to stop playing. Texas said, well, A&M is going to have to come back hat in hand. And I certainly don't think that's fair from both sides' perspective. Now A&M is turning the tables. And in fact, that may not be a bad thing for Texas. When you look at Jimbo Fisher in Texas A&M, and I said it earlier today, I've said it earlier this week, I firmly believe that Texas A&M is going to be a transcendent program in the ilk of a Clemson or an Alabama, and they're going to do it in the next 2 years. In fact, this Clemson game coming up tomorrow at Clemson could be the coming out party for Jimbo Fisher. He may need another year or two, but I think it's possible. You look at what he did with Florida State. What Jimbo Fisher did at Florida State, he did with no facilities. You look at what happened before he was there. You look at what's happened afterwards with the disaster that Willie Taggart is. It's not going to get any better. Mr. Taggart's not going to last there much longer because they don't have any facility. They're in the ACC, and they may be the beneficiary of a revenue flow from ESPN, thanks to the ACC network. But the odds are Willie Taggart's not going to be around to enjoy that revenue flow. So I think the job that Jimbo Fisher did at Florida State is nothing short of remarkable in taking them to a national championship. And now you have him at a program, Texas A&M, that has some tradition, but it's a long time ago. It's a venerable program, and it's a program with a lot of backing, a lot of money. And now you get the inflow from the SEC network. You get the inflow financially from the redo of the CBS network deal, which may include now other players. And the SEC is going to be the beneficiary of a lot of money going to a lot of the schools, not just A&M, but the Vanderbilts of the world. So you add in the kind of support, the already existing facilities that Jimbo Fisher has, and that continuing financial windfall that A&M is going to enjoy. And are you thinking what I'm thinking? You look at Florida State, look what he did there. You're telling me he can't do that at A&M? He absolutely can do it. I'm here to tell you he could do it. And you look at his schedule this year, it's a murderous schedule. Had they not had this murderous schedule, I think A&M would have been a major candidate for the college football playoff. And I think the time to really look at A&M coming in and becoming one of those perennial powerhouses is probably beginning next year, because the schedule just does not allow for it this year. When you take into account road games at Clemson, at Georgia, that game is on November 30th, and a home game against Alabama, you just can't expect A&M to be able to handle that. It's the toughest schedule in the country. But, LSU, Texas, that's a good matchup. I'm still waiting. I think the jury is still out on Joe Burrow. He showed flashes last season. We talked about it on the show yesterday. But I think we really don't know about Joe Burrow, and he's really the key to this whole team. LSU is going to have talent. They're going to fly to the ball. They're going to run the ball reasonably well, but they've got to have that trigger, man. And it's going to take a performance against a team like Texas, although Texas has lost a lot off their defense that dominated Georgia in the Sugar Bowl last year. I think LSU and Joe Burrow's performance against Texas will be a great indication of whether or not LSU is going to challenge an Alabama. I mean, you say, are they going to challenge Georgia? Well, they murdered Georgia last year in Baton Rouge. And that's a situation with LSU where they don't play Georgia every year. It's a split schedule in the SEC. So I'm going to be following that LSU Texas game. It's going to be an exciting game. It's a really neat culture class. It's the kind of game that we need to have in this sport, college football, more. But I wouldn't necessarily put much stock into it in terms of the college football playoff. Whichever team wins, I think, is going to be poised to make a run at it. But are they going to challenge Clemson? Are they going to challenge Alabama? I'll say this much. I don't see any scenario where Texas right now is going to challenge Clemson and Alabama when they lost 8-9 starters off of defense. Even though they played well against Georgia and beat the Bulldogs handily in the Sugar Bowl last year, of course, Georgia was dealing with a major letdown after blowing the second half lead against Alabama, thanks to Jalen Hurts. So you've got a Georgia team with an experienced quarterback with everybody back. And I think if Clemson and Alabama isn't 1-2, the other team in that scenario is going to be Georgia. And LSU, we'll find out on Saturday if they're a team that deserves to be in that discussion. The beauty of college football, of course, is talking about it right now and the pageantry that goes into University of Texas and LSU, and for that matter, Clemson and Texas A&M. What's interesting about this A&M team and what I'm telling you about them is I don't think Vegas necessarily sees it. When you look at the line, it was 18.5 minus 18.5 for Clemson to open, and that's gone down to about 17.5. But to me, that's ludicrous. I think it's going to be closer than that. And if I was a betting man, I'd be taking those 17 points right now. Kellen Mond, who's the quarterback for A&M, started a little slow against Texas State in their non-conference opener. But I see him getting a grasp of that Jimbo Fisher offense, his reads, the improvisation that Mitchell Trubisky did not have for the Chicago Bears, certainly yesterday. I'm seeing Kellen Mond get comfortable, and the flow is there. And that's what you have to have if they're going to compete against a team with the overwhelming defensive talent like Clemson. Of course, Trevor Lawrence looked extremely pedestrian in their opener against Georgia Tech, despite the fact that they blew out a Georgia Tech team that, to be honest, is going to be down this year and is going to be dealing, I think, with the aftermath of that Paul Johnson regime for some time now. So coming up, we're going to be talking to Tim Ring. He's in Phoenix, ABC 15, and we're going to talk about Kyler Murray and Cliff Kingsbury, Arizona Cardinals. We'll continue to talk about this subject, college football. And before we leave this subject, the last thing I want to mention, just to kind of wrap things up, is the A&M Texas game. The bottom line on it is Texas needs to come to A&M now, and they've got to have the hat in hand, and they've got to do what it takes to play that game, even if it means playing, I don't know, the first round of games in Houston, because that would essentially be a home game for A&M. I'd love to see it. Probably won't happen. But I think at the end of the day, when you think about the circumstances surrounding breaking off that relationship between those two schools, when you think about the circumstances of that discontinuation of that rivalry, I'm to the point now, and I think it's logical, I think it's reasonable to recognize that it's on Texas at this point. And I think A&M needs to give Texas a little consideration that they're not giving them right now. That is the administration. I think the administration now at Texas A&M isn't necessarily speaking for the students. They're not necessarily speaking for the public. I recognize why alumni, well-moneyed elite donors would not want to play Texas. What I understand, and I laid it out earlier, and to an extent, Texas deserves it. But I think that the people that are running Texas A&M and the big money donors and the trustees need to recognize that the students want the game on both campuses. The public would love to have the game, and I think the sport itself needs the game. So now we're going to bring in from Arizona Tim Ring from ABC 15. A venerable guy in the Valley of the Sun. He's going to fill us in on what's going on with the Arizona Cardinals. Hey, Tim, how you doing?
Brooks, man, good to see you, buddy. Thanks for having me on.
It's good to see you. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about Kyler Murray.
Okay.
And I want to get your impressions of the preseason because he opened kind of with a splash, but now it seems like they're kind of flying under the radar with Kyler and Kingsbury. What's the status report on those guys?
Well, you know what? Here's the deal with the Cardinals, Brooks, in the preseason. They didn't do jack squat offensively. He had a decent game coming out of the gates. He had a horrible game in game 2 against the Raiders. Then he had another decent game against the Vikings in game 3. Didn't play in game 4. In any of the 3 games he played in, they did not find the end zone once. And the Cardinals, you got me still?
Yeah, still got you.
Okay. Continue to say that you are not seeing the offense you're going to see Sunday when we open up against the Detroit Lions, and the offense you're going to see in the 2019 regular season. Kingsbury and the Cardinal coaching staff keeping everything under wraps, so they say. Now, are they just disguising the fact that maybe they just didn't play that well in the preseason? I don't know. We're going to find out soon enough here on Sunday. Murray, I can tell you this, Brooks. Murray is one hell of an athlete. I mean, there's a reason why he was a once-in-a-generation college quarterback. He can really move. He's built like a Mack truck. But I got to tell you this, watching him in person and even standing next to him at press conferences and in the locker room, Brooks, I have never in 30 years of covering the National Football League ever seen a quarterback, backup starter, third stringer, this short. He's not 5'10". I'm telling you right now, he's about 5'9".
Wow.
So if this works, he is going to be the first quarterback at that size to ever have success in the National Football League. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't like to be one of those guys that's going to be Mr. Hot Take and jump out there on a limb and say, no way, or absolutely. I prefer to watch it unfold with my own eyes and then make a determination as this thing unfolds. But I can tell you this, I've never seen a quarterback this size in the NFL succeed or not succeed. I've never seen it. I mean, Johnny Manziel, Drew Brees, Doug Flutie, these guys.
Russell Wilson.
Yeah, Russell Wilson has to have 2 inches on Kyler Murray.
Really?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I thought of when you said short. I want, in the context of Russell Wilson, where is Kyler Murray?
Yeah, shorter.
Right. Significantly shorter?
Yeah. I mean, Russell Wilson is. I don't know what they list him at, but he's probably a good 5'11". And I'm telling you, Kyler Murray is closer to 5'9" than he is 5'10". So that's 2 inches. Now, listen, I mean, are we splitting hairs on whether or not, that much is going to make a difference on whether or not you can play quarterback in the NFL? I don't know. I'm just saying the Cardinals have been so far out of the box with what they've done here, picking a quarterback this size, number 1 overall, and then hiring a college coach who was just fired for being under 500 in his career at Texas Tech, that, Dan Wetzel, actually, the great columnist at Yahoo, wrote an article the other day, and he called the Lions-Cardinals game not the best game of the weekend, but the most intriguing game of the weekend, because everybody's kind of waiting to see, not just here in Arizona. I think a lot of people around the country are waiting to see if Kingsbury and Kyler Murray, their offense, what they had success with in college, can translate in the NFL. Not that we're going to have all the answers after one game, but we will at least see the beginning of what they're trying to do here Sunday against Detroit.
I think one of the big things about Kyler Murray that doesn't get really any play is the incredible offensive line he had at Oklahoma. It was like 3 first-round picks. It was just unbelievable offensive line at Oklahoma. What kind of offensive line is he going to have with the Cardinals this year?
Yeah, Brooks, it's a question mark. There's no question about it. They have a veteran at center, a guy named A.Q. Shipley, who was hurt all of last year, so he's back. They have DJ Humphries out there on the left side. Humphries is a former first-round pick who's never quite reached his potential from a talent standpoint or from a health standpoint. He needs to be out there for 16 national anthems, not 12. Justin Pugh.
That's a good line. I like that.
Right. And he hasn't been. I mean, sooner or later, you got to be on the football field. Justin Pugh is at guard, and they plugged in some free agents on the other side. But that's going to be a problem. Defensive coordinators, I think, are seeing blood in the water with this offense, and they're going to get after Murray, and to try to put him in uncomfortable situations. And we're going to wait and see. Now, Murray, how much is he going to run? To me, that's the biggest question. A big part of this kid's arsenal, right? A big part of his weaponry are his legs. His ability to take off and run, and not just. There's different types of mobility, right, Brooks, in the NFL. There's the ability to avoid a sack. There's the ability to extend plays. And there's also the ability to maybe scamper for a first down here and there. I think Murray has all those, but I also think Murray has the ability to be dangerous with his legs. Now, history tells us that's also not sustainable in the NFL. Sustainable from a health standpoint and sustainable from a winning in the playoffs standpoint. But Murray is supposed to be unlike any other quarterback in the history of the NFL. I don't think we're going to see him fly off for 50, 60-yard touchdown runs like we saw in college, but will we see him pick up 20, 30, 35, 40-yard chunks at times?
Now, is the offense going to be designed for that, like a la Lamar Jackson kind of situation?
Yeah, I think it better be. I mean, otherwise, why do you have them? I mean, you don't draft.
But you watched preseason, you didn't get any indication of what we're going to have yet.
That's the problem, Brooks. I mean, we got it in training camp, watching, those guys going, half-assed in training camp in shorts. But yeah, we're kind of waiting to see them.
And you really can't practice that because he can't take hits. You can't do that in preseason.
Exactly.
Even if you wanted to.
Right. And so you don't know, did the defense let up or did he really scamper for 50 yards? I mean, so we're all kind of waiting to see as they unwrap the entire offense and the entire playbook. But but to me, you draft Kyler Murray because he's the ultimate weapon, right? To run and to throw. You don't have him to drop. You don't have him just to drop back and be a Tom Brady type. No, you have Kyler Murray to get him out on the edge, and put pressure on the defense. And to deliver throws out of the pocket, but also be a threat to run, whether it's, out of the pocket or designed run calls. That's why you pick the kid, right? I mean, you got to let him run. And I think we're going to see that on Sunday. At least I hope you will. I mean, to me, that's why you pick the kid. Let him run. Let him use his legs.
Now, you've been around a lot of NFL coaches. You've covered the NFL for a long time. Now, Cliff Kingsbury is an outlier. It's one of the most bizarre. I mean, the Bidwells always seem to top themselves somehow, every year. But my question to you is, being around Kingsbury, is he really running this team, or is there an experienced group of coaches, or is there anybody behind the scenes you think is guiding the situation? Because to bring in a guy with no experience like this, head coaching experience, not even close in the NFL, who has a losing record, is there anyone else behind the scenes? Are there any names out there, or is this really Cliff running things?
Brooks, you're a very wise man. Now I know why you're so wealthy up there, living in that mansion on the ocean.
Wish.
Living in that mansion on the ocean. No, you're exactly right. Cliff Kingsbury, and again, this is not a knock on his coaching abilities or whether or not he's going to succeed or not, but it's abundantly clear to me in listening to Kingsbury and the way he conducts himself that he is almost, in a way, he can't believe that he's here, right? He can't believe.
Really?
I just got fired from Texas Tech.
Right.
Great
agent.
I was fortunate to get picked up by USC to be their offensive coordinator. And now, holy crap, 3 weeks later, I'm coaching in the National Football League. I basically didn't play in the NFL. I damn sure didn't coach in the NFL. I've never even been a quality control guy in the NFL. And now I'm a head coach. So he's kind of got that gee whiz bewilderment.
So he really has that, though.
Yeah.
Being around him.
Right. And so now he's got to assemble a staff. And I'm getting to where your question was going. He couldn't really assemble a staff. So Steve Keim helped him do that. Now free agency starts, and he's not up on the NFL game. So Steve Keim handles the free agency, as most GMs would, but I don't think he had a part in that. Then the draft comes. They're not going to entrust draft decisions to Kingsbury when he was just at USC about 3 months earlier. So Keim handles all that. So Kingsbury's kind of gotten the controls of the team once OTAs and training camp began. But you get the feeling the entire time that Steve Keim, he's not coaching the team, but Steve Keim is really the leader right now, the general manager, if you don't know. Steve Keim, not you, your listeners and viewers. Steve Keim is really pulling the trigger on all things football related with this franchise right now. And Kingsbury, you can hear it in his answers. He's almost like Bruce Arians preceded Kingsbury. At Arians' press conference, there was no doubt who was in charge. He would say what was on his mind. He would rip guys. He would praise guys. He would tell you how it is. And with Kingsbury, you get the exact opposite. Almost as if, not that he doesn't know, but that he's almost a bit afraid to say anything that will get him in trouble with the people who are really running the team, Steve Keim and Mike Bidwell. With Kingsbury, you get a lot of, we'll see. I don't know. Well, we're going to find out. Well, we're working through that right now. We're continuing to have those talks. Well, we're going to see. You get a lot of that. You know where I'm going with that? You get a lot of that out of Kingsbury. So as the media, you're like, man, does this guy, come on, man. Let me give you a good example. Training camp. They were under center at the goal line, and he's never really been under center. And somebody asked him, hey, Cliff, what are the benefits of going under center when you're in short yardage at the goal line? And Kingsbury goes, I don't really know. I don't know. And the media said, well, then why are you doing it? He's like, I don't know. Like, well, you're the coach. And it's like, that was a perfect example.
It's like a comedy sketch.
Like, dude, are you going under center because Steve Keim told you that's what you need to do? And you can't even think of a reason why you need to be under center at the goal line?
Wow.
That's just one example where you're like, who's running the football team here in Arizona? You got at the time you had a 39-year-old head coach who just came from the college ranks, who was kind of like, I can't freaking believe that I'm here. And I think you had a veteran GM that kind of has taken the reins. So that's a great question, and I think I've answered it. That I think so. Like, this ain't New England, Brooks. This ain't New England,
right?
When you look at the Arizona Cardinals power structure right now, the head coach here has a lot less power and say than a head coach in many, many, many other organizations and franchises.
All right. The whole world wants to know how Herm is doing at Arizona State. What's the update on Herm Edwards?
You know what? Listen, they opened up with Kent State last week, and their quarterback, they're starting a true freshman quarterback for the first time in program history. Jake Plummer did not even start as a true freshman in his opening game. They looked okay in that game. Kent State, has had 2 winning seasons since you and I have been born. And Kent State got after him a little bit because they have a decimated offensive line because of injuries and some personnel defections because of some off the field issues. So they have a true freshman starting at center. I don't want to get too inside baseball on Arizona State football, but as we take a 30,000-foot view of it, as you all know, you need an offensive line to win football games. And it was good enough to beat Kent State. It'll be good enough to beat Sacramento State tonight, but then they go to Michigan State, and then Pac-12 conference play starts. And I wonder, with an inexperienced and young, maybe not all that talented offensive line, coupled with a true freshman quarterback, when they go to Michigan State and when they play some tougher conference games on the road, if Herm might not run into some problems. The one thing about Herm last year that people really enjoyed covering Arizona State and following Arizona State is that even though the final record wasn't great, Brooks, he was competitive in every game. The Todd Graham, Dennis Erickson regimes. Graham had a couple good years and Dennis had one good year, but they got blown out a lot. They got their ass kicked a lot. Herm last year, even in losses, was competitive. A lot of 7-point losses.
But can he recruit? I think that's the big question. Will he?
You know what? He's doing okay. Antonio Pierce, remember the great Giants linebacker?
Right.
He's on Herm's staff, and Antonio was coaching at Long Beach Poly, which down by you.
Good connection.
There's a lot of kids, yeah. And Pierce was at that school and has pulled out pretty much every great player from there, and has really been dialed into Southern California. So recruiting so far has been actually pretty good. I mean, has it been, is he pulling in top 10 classes? No, but he's pulling in top 30, 25 caliber classes, and that's going to need to continue. The question is, Brooks, I mean, Herm's an older guy. I mean, how much longer does he want to do this? It's only his second year. I'm not putting him out to pasture, but I would think Herm's got maybe 4 to 5 years in him, and then he's going to want to turn this thing over to somebody else. I think that was always kind of the goal going in, like, let me right the ship and then get out of Dodge.
So what about Mike Tomlin in Arizona? How much rope is he going to get?
Oh, Kevin Sumlin? Yeah. Listen,
Kevin Sumlin.
Yeah, no, sorry.
You read my mind. That's amazing.
Yeah. You know what?
How do you say Mike Tomlin?
Yeah, close enough.
Yeah. Kevin Sumlin, the head football coach at Arizona. All right.
Us in Phoenix, being a couple hours away from Tucson, we don't have boots on the ground with that program, Brooks. Like, I've never met Kevin Sumlin, so it's important to state that before I give my opinion. We don't cover them the way we cover Herm Edwards in Arizona State. But they've got a lot of problems down there. Yeah. I mean, the knives are out for Sumlin already. I mean, you go to Hawaii. Listen, you go to Hawaii and lose. That's bad enough. But, for those who followed that game, Hawaii turned the ball over 6 times. Hawaii did.
Right.
And still managed to win the game. That's how bad Arizona was in that game. And in talking to people who cover the team and some of my friends who went to school there that are ardent followers of the football team, the concern with someone is, here's a guy that at one point was a rising star in the coaching ranks, right? From Houston to the SEC, Johnny Manziel beat Alabama, right? And then his star really fell. And now he's in kind of college football Siberia with better weather. But the University of Arizona, I mean, they've never even been to the Rose Bowl. And you just wonder, how invested is Kevin Sumlin into the success of the University of Arizona? Like, is he just collecting a paycheck there? Because that team plays disinterested football. They were not good last year. They went into last year with their quarterback, if you remember, a Heisman candidate on the cover of Sports Illustrated, okay? And it was a disaster. And then they come out of the gates this year, and they lose to
Hawaii.
And
a bad league, too.
In a bad league. And their defensive coordinator, fans love to kill the defensive coordinator, right? I mean, most national fans probably couldn't tell you the defensive coordinator of Arizona, right? They'll point the finger at Sumlin or the coach. But local fans of the team, when the team gives up over 50 points a game in 3 straight losses, which this defense has done, they all want to fire the defensive coordinator. In this case, his name is Marcelo Yates. It's been around the block a while. If they give up they're going to play Northern Arizona on Saturday tomorrow, so they're probably going to kick their tail. But if it goes south again, expect someone to make a change at defensive coordinator and then go from there. But it's been put it this way, that was a coup to get Kevin Sumlin, right? For
theoretically,
like Arizona, and he has not delivered as of yet.
Yeah.
May turn it around, but so far it's been a dud.
Not looking good. Well, Tim, I really appreciate it. That was some amazing stuff out in the Valley, the Phoenix, the Valley of the Sun. And we look forward to having you on again soon.
You bet, buddy. Anytime, man. Come out and visit.
I will. I'm going to.
Wait about 2 months, though, Brooks. Wait about 2 months.
All right.
It's very hot. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know. It's really hot down here right now, too. But we'll see you soon. We're going to do that. I promise.
You got it, buddy. Okay.
Thanks, Tim. That's Tim Ring of ABC 15 in Phoenix, and a great show today. And how about Tim Ring, by the way? How great was he coming on the show and really giving us some deep dive insight into that Arizona Cardinals situation and Kyler Murray and just how short, boy, did he built that up, just how short Kyler Murray is. And you got to be kind of scratching your head at Michael Bidwell, the owner. Well, he is the president, but he is the owner's son of the Arizona Cardinals. This is what you have when you have families running teams. You have a government-sponsored monopoly in the NFL. So winning isn't always necessarily the priority. And I think it's pretty clear when you look at the Cardinals and the history of that franchise, just what's happened the last 2 or 3 years, where they bring in a coach, they bring in a GM, they blow them out, then they wash, rinse, and repeat again. And now we've got the situation, the strange situation with Kyler Murray. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens on Sunday between the Lions and the Cardinals. That's going to be, I think, a sidebar storyline that everybody was going to be tracking. And, it's not a good thing when you've got Tim Ring telling us, a guy who's at practice. First of all, the story he told about Cliff Kingsbury is not good. How deferential Kingsbury is to everybody, seemingly kind of looking around, waiting for a prompt when somebody asks him a question about the team. But then also the fact that the offense may well be based on the short burst, 20, 30-yard runs by Kyler Murray as part of that offense. I mean, that's something you can't really practice. You can't do that in preseason games. You don't want them to get hurt. But if you're going to rely on that for your offense, that's not good. And it may be an indication that this Cardinals offensive line ain't going to get it done. You got to remember a huge function of the success of Kyler Murray at Oklahoma came because of an extraordinarily talented offensive line at Oklahoma. Certainly he's not going to have that situation at Arizona with the Cardinals this year. So we're going to be back with you on Monday, noon Eastern time. We're going to wrap things up from out here in Los Angeles, California. It was a good week. We're still kind of a work in progress. What I really want to get into is I really want to start to germinate subjects and topics at Sports by Brooks on Twitter. Go to my Twitter timeline at Sports by Brooks. And we're going to be talking about some of the things. We'll be doing it over the weekend during the games that we're going to touch on beginning next week. We're also going to have some great guests next week. We're already lining up some big names. I hope you'll join us and get some insight into what's going on in the NFL, college football, and everything else that is going on. So I want to thank my producer in Boston, Cam Smith, and don't forget to follow me on Fancred, the app, too. What am I talking about? Of course, if you're on the Fancred app for the first time today, I want you to follow me. I've got an account. I'll be on it this weekend, and we'll be part of that community. I mean, one of the reasons why we're talking to Tim Ring, we're talking to John Canzano, we're talking to Arash Markazi, is we're going into these markets, and we're going to be doing that throughout the football season here on Fancred. And so everybody out there who's watching and listening, participating, I want to be interactive with you and your favorite team. I've got my favorite teams. We're going to have somebody on from Kansas City. In fact, Cam, make sure you remind me of that. I've got some ringers in Kansas City that I want to talk to as it pertains to the Chiefs and maybe the Royals too, possibly. So, but that's going to wrap things up from Los Angeles for now. I hope you join us coming up Monday at noon Eastern time, 9 Pacific. And this has been Sports by Brooks on Fancred.